Well, it's Coeliac Awareness Week, and welcome to our Dietitian Chat. Now, before I introduce you to our guest speaker, I'll just quickly introduce Suzanne Aiken, who's newly appointed Dietary Education Manager for Coeliac New Zealand. Thanks for joining us, Suzanne. Now, she'll be managing your questions in the chat function for tonight and asking Anna some of the questions. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I think most of you got your computers on mute anyway, but if you look at the bottom of the screen there, if you want to ask a question, if you put it into the chat function at the bottom, there's not too many of us, so you could probably, if Anna's talking, give her a chance to, sort of finish what she's saying, and then if you want to unmute and ask a question in relation to that, you probably could jump in. There's not too many of us. So if you have concerns about the gluten-free diet and how you are managing your child's celiac disease, and then this is a perfect opportunity for you to ask a few questions. Just a reminder that this is not a forum for personal medical advice. Now I'd like to introduce you to Anna. Anna has worked in private practice with both adults and children for over 20 years. Her primary focus is celiac disease, gastroenterology, allergy, and adverse food reactions at all stages of life, in conjunction with all her other general practice that she does. Anna is on the medical panel for both Coeliac New Zealand and Allergy New Zealand. Her clinical focus, significant experience, and a daughter with celiac disease gives her a unique perspective to answer all your questions tonight. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks, Lisa. Good evening, everybody. So ask away whatever you ever wanted to know but feel that you're not quite sure of about celiac disease.
Shall I start you off, Anna?
Yeah, Lisa, do that while everybody gets thinking.
While everyone gets their thinking caps on. Why should someone with celiac disease visit a dietitian, and how do they find a dietitian? What's sort of the process for that?
Well, I think to answer your the second part of your question first, I think the really important thing is to realise that while a few dietitians are generalists, most dietitians in private practice are specialists and have their specialist area of practice. So you probably, if you're going to hunt out a dietitian, find a dietitian who specialises in celiac disease and in gastroenterology. For example, if you came to me wanting to know something about renal disease, I wouldn't even take you through the front door. I'd be sending you away to a renal dietitian. So do your due diligence and find someone who specialises in the area, first of all. It does become a bit of an issue in small centres in the public service, because celiac disease is just one of many, many things that dietitians in the public arena have to do, particularly in the smaller centres. But they generally have someone who specialises in celiac disease. So why should you see a dietitian? Well, I think it's getting off on the right foot, understanding the basics up, separating the fact from fiction. As we all know, Captain Google is a great source of information, and not all of it is correct. And even patients who I think have done a pretty good job of initiating their gluten-free diet walk out the door saying that they didn't realise A, B, C, and D, and that they've got a lot out of it. So I think it's sort of starting you from the get-go with the right information, knowing what's credible, what's not. And also a dietitian has got several languages running through their head at the same time, not only educating you about celiac disease, but we have sub-programs like the nutritional adequacy of your diet running at the same time, which you're never going to get off a forum. And let's face it, when we're on a gluten-free diet, it does leave you vulnerable to a few nutritional holes that you've got to be making sure that you've plugged.
So Sam's just asking, she feels like her daughter isn't getting all the vitamins she needs. Do a lot of other children need multivitamins?
Look, in any multivitamins are only of use if you are deficient in the particular vitamin that you are supplementing. So when we look at a celiac diet, it's particularly the B group vitamins that we're concerned about because they're primarily found in things like our grains. They are also found in things like your dark green leafy vegetables. So most people, whether they be celiac or not, probably don't need a multivitamin supplement. And let's face it, we're built to run on real food and we absorb the nutrients from real food much, much better than we absorb the nutrients for supplements. When we have a newly diagnosed celiac, then yes, there will have been a lot of impaired nutrient absorption over goodness knows how long. When I ask patients to think back to when it might have all started, some of them are talking years. But ultimately, until those villi heal, until you exclude gluten, until you stop making the antibodies, until you start absorbing the nutrients properly, to start off with, it's really going to be money poorly wasted. So it's not going to make an awful lot of difference. And our B and C vitamins are water soluble. So if we take in any excess, they go in one end and out the other. So I think if there are other concurrent needs, or if we decide that we need to, there's a blood panel that we can run called nutritional bloods later on, which will actually tell us whether you're getting all the nutrients and whether you have stores of all the nutrients that you need. Many vitamins and minerals have a pretty long phase before you become deficient in those vitamins and minerals. So in a nutshell, there is no reason why any of us, if we're eating well, should need a nutritional supplement. So those that we particularly look at in celiac disease, many celiacs, particularly newly diagnosed, have pretty poor iron status. So that might be something that we look at. Many have pretty poor vitamin B12 status. So once again, we may look at vitamin B12 injections. And depending on whether there's a secondary lactose intolerance, we may choose to supplement with calcium. But I'm more of a believer in including, even if those that have an issue with lactose, the sugar that's in milk, making them feel pretty unwell for some while, using either lactose-free cow's milk or soy milk products that have really good bioavailability of that calcium, as opposed to your plant-based milks, which are pretty poor sources of calcium. So I think when you see your dietitian, they'll do a bit of a run through, and typically I will see patients 3 to 6 months later and at the 12-month mark, and we'll be doing an assessment. But in those early days, I know as a parent, all you want to do is make it better. All you want to do is make sure that your children are getting everything they need. But make your main focus on actually the diet and focusing on the fact that actually meat, fish, chicken, all our proteins, all our fruit, all our vegetables, none of those contain gluten. And it's only making sure that we've got a substitute for the grains. And then if we're substituting wheat, rye, oat, barley with things like brown rice and quinoa and amaranth, those are nutritional equivalents too. So in a nutshell, we probably don't need a multivite.
Jenna, you probably just sort of covered what somebody asked me this week at one of our buddy shopper events for tonight, which was how can I increase my fibre intake in a gluten-free diet?
I think one of the key things with that, Lisa, is making sure that every grain becomes another grain, so that you've got adequate fruit and vegetables in your diet. And really our ratio should be, in the adult world, about a quarter of your meal being protein, about a quarter being carbohydrate, and about half being vegetables. With children and athletes and those that are particularly skinny, malinky, active people, we look at thirds. But the key thing is making sure that the grains that you are now excluding are replaced by other grains, and then you'll get a very similar nutritional package. Bearing in mind too, you can up your fibre with things like nuts. Nuts and seeds are a great snack for those with celiac disease. And actually, shortly after Samantha was diagnosed, and certainly when she had little babies at home, I used to make her a great big jar of a mixture of nuts and seeds and a few cranberries in it that just sat on the end of the bench for dipping into at any time. So those sort of things can really increase your fibre too. But it's when the normal grainy bread gets replaced by just white bread or white rice, that's when the fibre really dips. So it's looking at that vast array of alternative grains, probably looking at more of your pulse-based pastas instead of your plain white gluten-free pastas and noodles that historically have been around. The world's a very, very different place now to what it was 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the products that are available.
So we just have a question here from Katie. She says her daughter has just been diagnosed and she's 2.5. Do you have any advice for the preschool who provides the food? It's all new to them.
Yeah, preschools are often pretty good because food allergy affects 1 in 10 children. So 1 in 10 children have food allergy. Of those, milk is the most prominent allergy in the under ones, egg in the over ones. So of any food facility anywhere, daycares and preschools actually have had experience, if not in celiac disease, they've had experience with food allergy before. And what they need to do is to apply those same food allergy principles to gluten in their diet. So certainly if they need any help, I would encourage them to go on the Coeliac New Zealand website, and there are lots of resources there. It can also be really useful to go on the ASCIA website. ASCIA is the Australasian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy. And while the focus is allergy rather than celiac disease, there are an awful lot of resources on there too, looking at things like a wheat-free diet, allergen cross-contamination, etc., that might be useful to them. And I think some of the other key things with a daycare is to watch the craft activities that they're doing. Make sure that the Play-Doh that they're using is gluten-free. Make sure that the paint that they're using for finger painting is gluten-free. If they're making things like, oh God, the word for it's come out, completely gone out of my head.
Something like that with the corn flour?
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking?
The flour-based glue.
Ones.
And just being really, really mindful of those craft activities. I remember back when my son was at kindergarten, he used to build these huge monstrosities out of leftover cereal boxes and all the rest of it. We don't want celiac children playing with things like leftover cereal boxes because goodness knows what's on them. So I think probably most daycares are going to be reasonably good at looking after the food side of things. What we need to focus on particularly is increasing their awareness of the craft side of things. And even, you know, once again, I remember when Tom was at kindy and they had a bird in the corner in a huge cage, but when you'd come in the morning, the bird seat was from here to kingdom come because the bird had obviously had a party overnight. Well, if any of those grains were gluten-containing grains, we need to be concerned about that. They've got rabbits in a hutch that they're feeding, any gluten-containing cereals. So it sort of probably takes you to go in with your eyes and your glasses on and look for the possible places of gluten exposure that the daycare probably aren't even aware about.
Another question, and this probably isn't just for celiac, but do you have any tips for fussy eaters and how to hide veggies? I think that's the age-old question.
As the celiac meets 2-year-old, I suppose ultimately we don't want veggies hidden. Ultimately, we want them on the plate and we want the child to make friends with veggies. And the sooner, if you don't put them on the plate every day, every meal, you're giving the message, I don't expect you to eat vegetables. And as a parent, we're hardwired to feed our children, and we want to know that they're eating vegetables. So by all means, and I'll give you some sneaky tips for adding vegetables, by all means add the sneaky vegetables, but still put the piece of broccoli, the piece of carrot on the plate. Don't differentiate between fruit and veggies. If you do a fruit platter for after school, mix up the veggies in it. The child doesn't know that cucumber and capsicum are actually termed vegetables and apple and pear are actually termed fruit. I tend to call them in my clinic, I call them living things. and that we want to have so many living things in our world. Otherwise, children will often start to differentiate. So you can do things, the age-old things like rating, bolognese is a great place. How many vegetables? How can you flip the ratio of vegetables to meat in your bolognese, which is absolutely fantastic. My daughter is a whiz at making muffins that are actually just about pea green because they've got so much spinach and kale and things in them. And the boys think it's absolutely wonderful to eat these. And yes, it gives the fibre. Yes, it gives the vitamins and minerals, but it doesn't actually teach the child to make friends with vegetables. The other thing to be aware of is that most vegetable aversion is actually texture related rather than taste related. So if you can pinpoint what textures your child is happy to eat, typically it is raw, crispy, crunchy. It makes it much, much easier to say, well, I don't actually need to cook that cauliflower. I can give it to them raw. And personally, I would eat raw cauliflower over cooked cauliflower any day of the week. So looking at that, being mindful too that textures are much easier for us to accept if they're a single texture. And the more different components we have in a food, the more difficult it is to eat. So a cherry tomato, for example, is actually really hard to eat. You bite through the skin, get it into the flesh, and then you've got a slurpy, squishy bit in the middle that goes pop in your mouth. So you're asking your sensory system to cope with many, many sensations all at the same time. But if you ask that same sensory system to cope with a piece of peeled apple, it's only coping with one sensation at a time. So we can do some sneaky things too, like serving things like peas, corn, and blueberries frozen. Because when they're frozen, there's only one texture. When you eat frozen peas and you've cooked them, there's the little skin bit and then there's the flesh bit in the middle, and it's a mixture of textures in your mouth. So when you're thinking about introducing vegetables to children, identify what textures they're happy to eat. Try and keep it to just one texture component in the mouth at a time, and also involve the child, make them a little bit invested. Get them to, even if they're helping you make a salad and they're picking up the slimy bits of cucumber and the squishy bits of tomato and putting it in the salad for you to eat, they're interacting with those vegetables. So they might like to go to the fruit and veggie shop and buy the two-legged carrot and bring it home and put it on their plate to eat for dinner. So don't just focus entirely on hiding those vegetables. Focus more on celebrating those vegetables and trying to identify the texture story that's acceptable for them. Hope that gives you some clues.
Yeah, go for it, Emma, go.
And I haven't typed it out because I'm not quite sure what it is, but maybe if I say it, I'll get to some kind of idea.
Sure, go.
So I'm worried that now my son has one autoimmune disease that he's going to end up with many. So I don't know if this is your area, but I gather he's slightly more likely to wind up with type 1 diabetes. And I'm wondering if the diet that he's on now, which is completely gluten-free and his bloods have come right down to normalish, but I think we are quite heavily reliant on sugary things and quite processed stuff as snacks. Is he ultimately also more likely to end up with type 2 diabetes through that pathway?
I mean, I'm not the endocrinologist, I'm a dietitian. Yes, when we have one autoimmune disease, we are at greater risk of developing another autoimmune disease. But that doesn't mean that it's ever going to happen. And we don't actually truly understand what flicks the switch and what makes us develop an autoimmune disease in the first place. I mean, even when we look amongst our family members, if you've got a first-degree family member with celiac disease, you've got a 1 in 10 chance of developing celiac disease. That also means you've got a 90% chance of not developing celiac disease. So we don't really know. We don't know what flicks the switch, but we do continue to monitor both those with type 1 diabetes for celiac disease and those with celiac disease for type 1 diabetes. In my clinical career, I've seen quite a few type 1 diabetics who have later been diagnosed as celiac. I haven't seen, in living memory, anyone with celiac disease who has then been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, certainly in the space that I work in. What we eat as part of our diet does not determine whether we're going to get type 1 diabetes or not. That is more the role of type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, what happens is that we develop some insulin resistance. Either you've asked the pancreas to do too much over a lifetime by continuing to ask it to donate some insulin because you're eating so much sugar, or in people that are very, very overweight, so the cell isn't receptive to insulin anymore. So there are a lot of lifestyle factors that will determine type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is not in the same camp as type 1 diabetes. I think as a general rule, any of us should try as much as we can to avoid the packety stuff, and sometimes it's easier said than done, but focus more on whole foods as much as you possibly can. And the more you can teach your child to focus on whole foods too, the less they have to read a packet because it didn't come out of a packet, and unless it's a grain, it's not going to have gluten in it anyway. So as far as type 1 diabetes is concerned, I hear your concern. Yes, it's always a risk. There's actually nothing we can do about it. Often what is the catalyst for type 1 diabetes is often just a viral illness in childhood. So there's absolutely nothing other than putting your child in a little bubble and never letting them out. There's nothing we can do about that. But the focus on a whole food diet and keeping the fibre up, keeping the sugar down, can actually alter the outcome of possible type 2 diabetes later on in life. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Do celiacs often have ongoing deficiencies even when on a strict gluten-free diet?
If a celiac is on a strict gluten-free diet, their serology has returned to normal, then we can assume complete villus healing. And there should not, other than dietary deficiencies contributing to nutrient deficiencies. So when we look at nutrient deficiencies, there's two issues. One, what are we putting in? And the other one, how well are we absorbing it? So in terms of absorption or utilization of those nutrients, assuming a strict gluten-free diet and close management and complete villus healing, there should be no reason why we shouldn't be able to absorb all of those nutrients. It then depends on what nutrients we're putting in, basically, and making sure that we've got a good balance and we've still got adequate grains, fruit, vegetables, iron-rich foods. So technically, there should be no reason why that should be an issue. But if you are choosing to avoid a lot of grains, then that can open your hole to particularly the B vitamins and fibre.
Well, one was related to what you were talking about with people that have got type 2 diabetes and then develop celiac disease, selecting low starch vegetables, but they asked, what are some of the low starch vegetables?
Honestly, Lisa, our practice in terms of diabetes has changed so much. I've been a dietitian for quite a few decades now. And in the dim distance past, we even counted the carbohydrates and things like carrots and things like that, which we don't so much anymore. So, I mean, I think you asked about type 2 diabetes in the question. Are you meaning more type 1 diabetes?
Well, they just asked what can a diabetic with celiac disease eat, but they mentioned if we were selecting low starch vegetables.
Pretty much the only ones that I'm not a diabetes expert. I see quite a few type 2 diabetics. I do not see those with type 1 diabetes. That's not my area of specialty at all. But pretty much the only vegetables that I get unduly stressed about being fairly accurate about the portions on are things like potato and kumara, or products like peas and corn in large quantities. But contrary to what was the practice sort of 40 years ago, we no longer are concerned about carrots and products like that anymore. And I think it's far more important that we're concerned about more, especially when we look at type 2 diabetics, protein being quarter of the meal, palm-sized protein, carbohydrate being fist size, and veggies being at least half your meal. I think one of the big challenges those with diabetes and celiac disease have is that many gluten-free foods can have quite a high glycemic index. And that means that, pretty well, in a nutshell, any carbohydrate food that we eat ultimately ends up as sugars. It's just some of them take longer to end up in sugars and be absorbed than others. Those with a high glycemic index are those that we digest and absorb very, very quickly. So they cause a rise in blood sugars very, very quickly. And certainly when we look at things like rice crackers and white rice and rice noodles and products like that, they've all got a very high glycemic index, and they will potentially cause a problem to those with diabetes. But if, as an alternative to those, we tend to use things with more nuts and seeds and grains in them. We use things like our pulse-based pastas. We use things like brown rice. We use crackers that have got more grains and nuts and seeds in them. We're going to circumvent that. The other thing that makes a big difference is whether you eat these largely refined carbohydrate products in isolation or whether you eat them as part of a meal. So if you were to sit down, I had a bloke in this afternoon, not a diabetic, but he can hoover an entire packet of rice crackers after school. That if you had diabetes, that would cause a significant rise in your blood sugars. But if you had a few rice crackers with some cheese on it, for example, the cheese would actually average that down. Or if you were going to have, I don't know, gluten-free shortbread or something, but you happen to have it with a milky coffee at the same time, the milky coffee would sort of average that down. So basically what we eat in isolation, we absorb very much more quickly than foods that we eat as part of a mixed meal or part of a mixed snack. So if you made your rule of thumb, always to make sure if you're having things like, if you've got diabetes, if you're having things like rice crackers, always have some protein with it at the same time. Dip it in some hummus, put a piece of cheese on top, and have a milky coffee with it. And if you've got type 1 diabetes, you should be under the care of a specialist diabetes dietitian who will actually adjust your insulin to your diet and your exercise and what your body needs.
Great, thanks, Hannah. The other one that I had remember ask is about what other, I guess, tips and ideas that they could include in their children's lunchbox. Rather than, there's so many packets of food out there, which just because they've got gluten-free on them does not necessarily mean they're healthy. So these people were trying to find lots of other interesting ways of putting things into the lunchbox.
Oh, look, I think lunchboxes do everybody's head, and not just those that have children with celiac disease. I think lunchboxes are a bit of a minefield, really. I mean, certainly when my children were at that stage, I had a bit of a formula, and it was something fruity, something vegetable-y. There was a hero that was the main source of nutrition, something sort of snacky, crackery, and then something a little bit fun at the same time. And there's no reason why you can't follow that similar formula. I think the key thing is that often gluten-free sandwiches aren't quite as sexy as a regular sandwich. So what often works really well in children with celiac disease is having more of an antipasto sort of a lunchbox where it's nibbly bits of this and that. The more you can persuade your children that they like things like a cold sausage or a cold chicken drum or a bit of something left over from dinner in their lunch, that certainly makes a good mainstay. Using, now you can get some fantastic little flasks. So doing a little wide mouth thermos flask of leftover spaghetti bolognese, even heating up chili beans and having a bit of cheese on top, and they can take a separate little pack packet of corn chips and pretend that they're having nachos for lunch. Freezing family meals when there is something that can go in a flask. But I think the flask meals and the antipasto type lunch boxes work really well. Looking at things like frittata, savoury muffins are a great place to pack in things like grated carrot and grated courgette and cheese and feta. So we need something that's got some protein in it. Protein keeps us going for 3 or 4 hours. So make sure that there is adequate protein in the lunchbox and it isn't all just snacky things. Unfortunately, for many children, things like boiled eggs are a bit of lunchbox suicide, really. I remember back to school and had that opened their lunchbox with a hard-boiled egg in it. But having a look at dinner and deliberately making sure that if you're going to cook chicken breast, that you've cooked an extra chicken breast so that you can actually fill up something like a gluten-free wrap and actually have loads of chicken in it so that we can keep going. Yogurt, hummus. So there are quite a range of things. But yeah, I agree with you, Lisa. There are an awful lot of packety foods out there and many of them are not great at all. Certainly with my children, I suppose a tough dietitian mother, I try to keep packets to an absolute minimum and perhaps look at no more, maximum 1 packet in a day, and I tried for 1 packet a week, but that was quite a few years ago now, and maybe I'm being a little bit naive. But it's okay too to have some things in terms of packety food that you might only have in the lunchbox. And when you're at home, so my kids knew that if they might get the occasional packet of potato chips in the lunchbox, but they knew never to ask for them when they were at home because they were lunchbox food. And when we're at home, there are more of the whole foods that are easier to serve at home. Make sure too that you can keep the lunchbox cold. One of the most common reasons for children not liking cheese in their lunchbox is it goes all oozy and oily. So getting a cold pack to go in the lunchbox. In our household, we regularly get a fish delivery to the doorstep, and it comes with one of those lovely big sort of, looks like a big eiderdown, but it's a cold pack. And as long as you cut very, very carefully and don't cut the cold pack, you can freeze all those little pockets as individual cold packs. And because they've only come in your fish delivery, you don't actually mind if they don't come home again because they didn't cost you anything in the first place. So just making sure, particularly in summer, that you're keeping your lunchbox nice and cold. Developing child skills and making homemade sushi can be a really good one too. Often commercial sushi is too big for children. It's got too much rice. It's not chopped thickly enough. It all falls to pieces. But if you can make it at home, you can minimize the rice and maximize what goes in it and make the whole roll a little bit thinner so that your children can pick it up easily and eat it in their fingers. And if you set out to make sushi as a separate exercise, it does seem a bit of a major. But if you can cook the sushi rice while you're boiling the potatoes, pop your sushi vinegar on it, let it cool down, and make sure that the protein that you're cooking for night is something that can go in the sushi. It actually makes it really fast and easy to whip up after dinner for lunch the next day. So I think either look at your antipasto style lunches or consider your thermos flask type lunches, because that way your children are going to get something that's really going to keep body and soul together.
Yes, I do. Emma wants to know around the suggestion for a timeline for follow-up bloods for antibodies or nutritional bloods, and add on to that, should they be monitored even when they're in the normal range, and what kind of time frame would that look like? Thanks, Anna.
Well, I think either way, we want anyone with celiac disease to have their blood work done annually. So I typically say choose a day, your birthday, the day you were diagnosed, whatever. With children, it's really interesting because I work very closely with 2 pediatric gastros, one at McMurray and one at Maranui, and also see a lot of patients from a 3rd one, and they all have different recommendations. I think often they're wanting to have a look, say 3 months down the track, just to check that things are tracking down. I get a wee bit concerned about that because a lot of families just get disheartened that the bloods aren't within normal ranges already. And So if we give it a good year or so, that's perhaps a more accurate indicator. It can take up to 2 years for your serology to come back into line again. Now, the reason we want your serology done on an annual basis is that, as you're probably very aware, that there's absolutely no correlation between symptoms and gastrointestinal damage. So we can have those that are completely asymptomatic. I have people coming into clinic all the time saying, oh, I'm only mildly celiac. To which I reply, well, celiac disease is like pregnancy. You either are or you aren't. You're not a little bit pregnant and you're not a little bit celiac either. So irrespective of your symptoms, we want complete exclusion of gluten lifelong. I was involved with some research probably 5 or 10 years ago now with a gastro, and we pulled our cohort from lab tests, and anyone who'd had celiac disease for 10 years or more were invited to be part of the study. I asked to be blinded to what the serology was until after I had seen them. But we had people from those that had had celiac disease for 20 years that had never had serology done, and their serology looked like they'd never been diagnosed in the first place, to those that showed obviously pretty close adherence to their diet. And because there are no other predictors of how well you're managing celiac disease, that's where we need the serology. And our concern is that if your serology isn't coming back into line, that we're casting the net wider and we're having a look and we're saying, why? Is there any low-grade exposure to gluten? Is there anything that we can do differently? I've had patients before who have been getting gluten in their medication, and they've been completely unaware that the medication or the supplements that they've been consuming have gluten in them. And then there's the fallout. There's the osteoporosis or the fertility issues and all of those issues further down the track. So if you have your serology done annually, you get your feedback annually and you can do something about it rather than just sort of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best.
Isla wanted to know around going to a restaurant, and you've had a conversation and they say that they're careful of cross-contamination, but they can't guarantee as there's gluten in the kitchen. Should this place be avoided entirely? I guess the question that she asks also is, what further questions can then be asked to ensure that it's a safe place for someone with celiac to eat?
Yeah. I mean, in an ideal world, it would be a restaurant that was dining out program accredited, so that we know that they're well educated in what they're doing. But hey, there's a fine line. If you've got celiac disease and you've got to follow a gluten-free diet, that's a given. But it's a real world, and you've also got to live. And I think ringing the restaurant ahead and saying, I've got someone coming with celiac disease, asking a few open-ended questions so that you get a bit of a sense of whether they understand or not. I think also asking a few targeted questions. So what else are you cooking in the fryer, for example, if they haven't actually told you what you can eat or not eat on the menu. I think using things like the Coeliac Facebook page to ask others in your area, and I always encourage new patients to go on and say, hey, I live in wherever you live, and I've got a 9-year-old newly diagnosed with celiac disease, and where do you know, i.e. you or the members, the people that do this stuff, know that I can go, that I can eat out safely. And that's a really good start, that word of mouth. And I think any of you with celiac disease probably build up a selection of tried and trusted places. I know as a family, I mean, we're less in the loop now that Madam has 2 preschoolers at home, but certainly we've got a handful of places that we know that we can go and eat out as a family, and we can trust them completely, and they get it absolutely completely. So I think some of it is Isla asking those open-ended questions. What else have you cooked in the fryer? Can you tell me on the menu which are the dishes that are safe for me to order? And then asking those secondary questions after that. I mean, any of us, whether you've got celiac disease, whether you have food allergy, have to get to a point where you've got to trust them at some point. But I think, and ask your friends, ask your celiac friends on the celiac Facebook page, and you'll get a lot of feedback. Prior to lockdown, I had a fantastic list going of restaurants that patients, well, Madam started it off before when she was in a corporate world, and then patients had it on the proviso that if they found anywhere else that was great, they had it to add it to the bottom of the list. And the list was administered by my receptionist. But post-COVID and post-Madam no longer being in a corporate world, it sort of died a bit of a natural. But maybe, Lisa, maybe that's something that we could, set up a blackboard somewhere that patients could, or those with celiac disease members, can pop some recommendations on without any endorsement from Coeliac New Zealand, but just member-to-member recommendations. And it might be 3 strikes if you get 3 people ringing up and say that place is no good anymore, it comes off. But it would be great to have that forum again, because patients really loved having this list that had got up to about 150 restaurants around sort of central suburbs of Auckland. So maybe that's something that we all need to look at as a bit of a team.
It's a bit general, but I'm sure you can handle it, Anna. It just said, what about smoothies, veggies or fruit, protein powder or not?
Fundamentally, as a dietitian, I hate smoothies with a passion. And as an allergy dietitian, I hate smoothies with a passion. When we eat whole food, we chew it. Our eyes see that we're eating it. Our jaw feels that we're eating it. Our tummy feels full. And we actually add a lot of very important anti-inflammatory enzymes when we're chewing it. One of my colleagues, who's an immunologist on the Gold Coast, has done a lot of work into the anti-inflammatory nature of chewing and the importance of chewing in your diet, as opposed to just mushing it all up and drinking it. So many people think, well, a smoothie is a really good place to get a bunch of kale and all the, it's a banana graveyard and whatever else. And yes, to a certain extent it is. And yes, having a smoothie for breakfast before you run out the door is better than having nothing at all. But it would be even better to chop the fruit up and have it in a bowl with things like your yogurt on top and actually eat it and enjoy it and acknowledge that you've eaten something. Protein powder or not protein powder, most of us don't need protein powders. Most of us would be better to put some milk in, and if you've got an issue with lactose, use lactose-free milk, and pop some yogurt in and push blast. There is a very small cohort of the population that actually need protein powders, and they're people called the top flight rowers and the All Blacks and people like that if they were to get all of their protein requirements from poached eggs on toast, they'd probably be eating 2 dozen poached eggs for breakfast, and they would sort of lose their gloss after a while. Most of us don't need that degree of additional protein. To make a muscle get bigger, we need to use it again and again and again and again. And there's no correlation, other than severe deficiency in protein, there is no correlation between eating more protein and building bigger muscles. I mean, when we look at some of the African tribes that have very low protein diets, they're hugely well muscled because those muscles have been used again and again and again and again. So the other little cohort I see that I'll sometimes use protein powders for, more with my sort of allergy type presentation, say with some of the mums that I see, breastfeeding mums whose babies have got cow's milk and soy proctocolitis, often with egg as well. So these little babies get blood and mucus in their poo, and mum has to completely exclude typically dairy and soy, and often with egg as well, from her diet to stop these little babies getting blood in their poo. And a lot of these women struggle to get enough protein into their diet using, meat, fish, chicken, particularly if they're vegetarian. So in that cohort, often I'll use something like a rice protein or a pea protein to make up that difference for them. But most of us don't need to add protein powders in. And in children in particular, I get a bit antsy about it because their kidneys are immature, and if we have a really, really high protein load, their poor little kidneys are trying to keep up. The other thing that is often missed in terms of protein is that if we have an exceptionally high protein load, it can actually cause us to lose calcium from our bones, which is of concern. And let's face it, we seldom overdo it if we use whole food, but it's really easy to overdo it if we start using a lot of supplements. Also, putting on an athlete's hat, depending on where those supplements have come from, they sometimes don't fit within our drug regulations here. So athletes have to be pretty careful about their source of their protein powder if they're using them. So I would say not in children, not for most of us. Try and use whole food instead. If you don't want to use cow's milk, use soy milk. Actually, just be aware too that dairy and soy have very similar macro and micronutrients, similar protein, similar fat, similar calcium, and the bioavailability of that calcium is pretty equivalent. But the other plant-based milks on the market are almost universally much, much lower in protein, lower in fat, and lower in calcium. Coconut's one that's really taken off, and coconut actually has next to no protein in it. Its nutritional equivalent is actually a bowl of whipped cream. So coconut is the only plant-based milk that actually contains saturated fat. And so when we look at coconut yogurt and coconut ice cream, we're getting a lot of fat, but we're not getting protein and we're not getting calcium. So a lot of people are really surprised. And in fact, internationally, there's a bit of a move underway to try and bring in legislation whereby other plant-based juices can't be termed milk to avoid the confusion, but watch this space. So dairy or soy, whatever you want to do, they're fairly nutritionally equivalent. Just be aware if you're using the other plant-based milks that they are poor sources of protein, calcium and fat, with the exception of coconut, which is an exceptional source of fat. But just don't think you're necessarily doing the healthy thing if you're using it. Hope that answered your question, Suzanne. Add anything that you want to at any stage. Any more questions from anyone?
I don't think there's any others. It was interesting what you mentioned about the medicines before too, Anna. I had two queries or people mentioned this week that didn't realize there was gluten in medicine. And so
yeah, medication is covered by completely different labeling legislation to food, which many people don't realize. And so things like supplements and medications, I always suggest to patients that they always get their prescription from the same pharmacy, and the pharmacy has loaded that you're celiac so that they do a bit of a check. My daughter actually got with folate containing gluten, and it wasn't until I realized quite some months later that she was actually on it, because she doesn't live here, that I was able to intervene. And now, we do have a funded folate that is gluten-free, which is fantastic, but many pharmacists too aren't aware that they need to check. But you'd have far better odds with a pharmacy than a health food shop. So just make your purchases from a pharmacy, get the pharmacy to check. They've actually got access to a website where they can actually check the MedSafe sheet on any of your medications too. Yeah, cold and flu medications are some big ones too. And sort of if you've got a really nasty cold, you're probably better to take Panadol and antihistamine rather than look at one of the cold and flu medications, which commonly contain gluten as an excipient in them.